Hey everybody, it's Rob from Man Sewing, and I am totally geared up about today's tutorial. That's right, this quilt behind me has actually been something I've been dreaming for a long time. Now, before I show you around the quilt, I want to tell you where the story started. I was teaching up in Washington a few years ago, and I had a woman in my class, and yes, she was from my grandmother's generation, and she was way cooler than I even. She kept talking about this thing called steampunk, and I didn't want her to know. I had no idea what steampunk was. I thought it was a music style. So I went home and Googled steampunk, and I found steampunk to me is like the Terminator filmed in the Victorian age in all sepia tone footage. So I wanted to create a quilt. If you look closely, it's basically a simple broken dishes pattern, and I'm using gradient colors. I'm going to talk about the fabrics in a second. And then these gears are simply appliqued on top, and the gears were brought to me because I just got a cool new die cutter from Sizzix, and the gears are part of it, but I've got some drawn gears you can have as a printable as well. So with that, let's talk about the fabric choices. Two different brands we're using today. We have Northcott's Sandscapes. This is what we're using for the half square triangles in the background for the broken dishes. Of course, you figured that out. And we're also using the Kona Solids. This is called Gray Area, and it's a really cool pre-cut of a bunch of different shades of gray. And that's what I've used to form all of the gears in the background and their shadows. So you ready to get started? So, as I said, this quilt is two parts, the background and the applique is the second part. So we're starting with our Sandscapes, and this has got about 42 pieces in it, roughly 4 of every color, and we're gonna have 10 different fabrics showing. Let me get this part out of the way, and I literally broke down my pre-cut pack, peeled them off, and put them in color gradient order from my darkest all the way down here to my lightest. They did not come out of my pack exactly in that order, but it was really easy to see the differences. Once we have all of our fabrics separated, we're going to make 2 separate piles. We're going to build some high contrast blocks and some low contrast blocks. So these are more of the low contrast up here. And you can see in here, these are more of our high contrast, and that just comes from our different choices of colors. So real easy, we're going to start with our low contrast blocks, and I'm going to take fabric 1 and fabric 2, and I'm just going to set them together, and then I'm going to put them in my pile I've labeled low contrast. I'm going to do that twice because you're going to have at least 4 squares of everything. And don't worry about right sides together yet. We're going to get there. Okay, so now we're going to start our high contrast pile, and it gets a little bit more confusing, but watch this. So count over. Here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's my first group. So I'm going to slightly rotate 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 so that as I'm going through my piles, I can kind of keep track. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take from basically pile number 1 and pile number 6 and build a high contrast group here and here. And then I'm just going to continue to work my way around the table, building them up this way so that I'm making lots of different color combos actually. And then the turnaround is sometimes where my eye gets confused down in there because of the reach, but having those on point really helps me stay organized. Now, once these are all done like this, we still have a little bit of cutting chores to take care of. So I am going to quickly get this stuff out of our way. That was easy. Okay, now, are you ready to go ahead and handle some of the cutting chores? So we're actually making 5-inch blocks out of our 10-inch blocks. So one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to take and slow down and build, keeping my sets together. So technically what I'm trying to say is I have 2 pieces of fabric, and I'm going to cut in layers of about 6. So 3 groupings at a time. Just because with many more than that, I start to get a little bit hazardous with my slicing and dicing. So these should be as accurate as possible, okay? But at this moment, I'm just going to go ahead and take and make these down into 5-inch squares. So I'm measuring over on my ruler, and I'm kind of looking at the outside edge of the pink bumps there, like yay. And then I can turn and rotate this on the Lazy Susan, which I love so much. And we're going to go ahead and make a second cut. So super easy. Go ahead and do that to all of your stacks. Just make sure you're keeping your two pieces of fabric together, right? The next thing you need to be aware of is these individual groupings are going to stay and become our half square triangle bases. So you've probably seen Jenny Doan do these wonderful half square triangles where you take your two fabrics and you basically lay them right sides together. And then we're just going to sew around all of the edges. So before I go to the sewing machine, what I really like to do is work through my stack and I just start flipping them so they're right sides together. So I'm totally ready to go when I get to my machine. So I'm just going to keep working through my piles. And if you can keep your similar fabrics together, it'll make the organization easier later. So like I said, build your sets, get them right sides together. And then as we go to our sewing machine, we are going to have our two fabrics right sides together, just like yay. And then I'd like you to go ahead and sew around all four sides so that when you're done, it looks just like that. Now, easiest way to cut these is off of a Lazy Susan mat. But if you don't have one at home, you can certainly cut it standard, but the key is don't move your block after the first cut. So the first cut is going to go right through the corners there. So if I was not on a Lazy Susan, I would cut, I would not move, I would simply take my ruler like that. But because I've got the benefit of modern technology, let's enjoy it a little bit today. So I'm going to slice, swing, and prepare to slice again. And I'm basically laying my ruler right on the cross of the threads. And now when those are done like that, these are going to open up to form four individual half square triangle units. And as I'm opening them up, I come to my iron and I'm just pressing them. So darkest fabric is in the up position, and then I'm pressing it like this so that my seam allowance goes to the dark side. So, one of the things I learned in creating all of these millions of half square triangles, and I literally did the entire background of this quilt in under 3 hours, all pieced, all assembled, everything, was that if you keep all of your seams facing the darks, later on, it makes it much easier for assembly because we're going to take these wonderful little half square triangles and build the broken dishes block. So to build a broken dishes block, they're basically opposite colors touching each other as we go around, just like that. So at this moment, what I go ahead and do is take two at a time, and I would head to my sewing machine. And of course, all of this is done with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, right? 1/4 inch seam allowance, fold, 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then I press them open and I come back in and I assemble it. So when it's all stitched, it looks just like that. Let me get these out of the way. Maybe that'll make it a little prettier for you at home. So it's going to look just like that. And these units here simply start to form all of the color gradation you see within the quilt. Now, let's take a quick moment. There's two different ways to lay this quilt out and construct it. The fast and easy way is like I did. In these, let's just call these, I can't call them a 4-patch because they're not. Let's call them a 4-cube. We're making up new quilting terms today. So the 4-cube makes it easier to manipulate them all around the quilt. But it also means that your seam allowance is maybe heading in all different directions. So if you are looking for perfection in this, you could lay out each individual half square triangle on your design wall and really get even more color movement throughout your quilt than I did. But it's going to take a lot more management on your part. So I always take the path of least resistance, if you know what I'm saying. The other fun thing about stitching with these half square triangles like this is technically you're now working off of the bias. So all you have to do is nest your seams together, and if they're not exactly the same, you can kind of just stretch them under the needle of the machine and they come out beautifully. So let me give you a little bit more detailed information about what was going through my color sense while I was playing with these blocks as I was managing. Remember, you've got all of your high contrast and all of your low contrast blocks assembled. And I've built them in these 4 cubes so that I can go ahead and quickly move them around in the quilt. But I also want to point out that I started using my low contrast but my darkest blocks down here in the bottom corner. Those of you who've been watching a lot of the man sewing tutorials, you know that I like my lightest fabrics usually up in here and my darker fabrics down here. So that was my approach again here. But again, low contrast blocks, and then I would use occasionally some of the higher contrast blocks to bounce the color in and out and shift. So mostly low contrast in this area, mostly the higher contrast in this area, but then also my darker blocks and my lighter blocks up in here. And I generally kept them in either 4 chunks of each section or kind of L shapes, and that helped me kind of manage and carry the color around. But of course, the fun way to do this is put it on your own design wall and take your time and just be creative and enjoy it. Quick tip on that, a lot of us will rush through the design process. I am learning to slow down a little bit. I know, it's hard to believe, but I slow down just a little bit and I let my quilt sit on the design wall at least 24 hours before I make the final decision. And that's really helped me. I go in and out all day long looking at it, and it really helps me find that one thing that I changed before I wish I would have changed it. Now, let's start talking about some of those appliques. Okay, so let me get you all geared up to do these applique. And as I mentioned earlier, you're using your Kaufman gray area fabrics, and I love these because of all the different gradients within, or the different shades of gray. So if you look carefully at my gears, I'm not just using the same color as my top gear and the black or dark gray for my background or my shadow. I'm actually making all kinds of different color combos. And when I prepared my gears, of course, I used a die cutter, but I want to show you how to do some other simple ways if you don't have a die cutter at home. First of all, thanks again, Art Department at Man Sewing. We've prepared for you some very similar looking gears to what I've got behind you. So this would be a printable, free download, and the little links in the description below. And you can just take this and you can just trace with your fusible web. I'm always using Heat and Bond Feather Light because I love the way it works. So I've just traced that with a pen. And then once it was traced on, you're going to iron it to the backside. Of course, they're solid, so it doesn't really matter. Iron that on there, and then you're just going to cut that out with scissors. Now, I had some fun gears laying around my house. So this one here, I simply traced my gear. And again, anytime I'm doing this, I'm going to try to cut out a couple of layers at once, so I only have to draw it one time, but I'm getting my shadow and the top color of the gear as I go. So that's another way of doing it. Tracing household objects is always fun. Now, this gear I made right here using a circular rotary cutter tool. So I had fusible web on the back first, and then what I do for that is I use my little New Year's Eve party favor that doubles as a rotary cutter, and I'm going to set up my first circle. And I can measure here, and I know because it's a 5-inch square, I've got only a little bit, I'm going to say 2.5, but I always go just a little under. And then I'm just checking my edges to make sure I'm on track. So now I need to move just slightly this way. Good, good, good. Pull the blade back, or the blade cover, I should say. And then just a nice, easy cut, just like that. Now, once that's cut, the tool then moves to the outside, and this rotary cutter, this Lazy Susan mat here, is fantastic, but not for this project. So I'm going to take a second, move this here, because I don't want this spinning around too much. And now I'm going to actually take and I'm just going to take little wedges out of my gear as I go around. Of course, this takes a little bit more practice and is not nearly as symmetrical looking as you can see. This one obviously turned out a little bit better. And then of course you'd want to cut a hole in the center. And here's a trick. Maybe you don't know where the center point was, but you can see it on the back in the paper. So you can always come back here to get that center hole cut out, just like that. Okay, so those are a couple of easy ways to create your own gears at home, but I was really excited. Like I said, it was Sizzix that offered me the gear dies that got me so excited and opened the door to create this quilt in a heartbeat. But many of you don't even know what die cutting is, so let me show you. This tool that just popped on the set over here is the Sizzix brand, and the reason I like the Sizzix is you can use any other brand's dies within here. So a die looks like this, and I have 2 different sizes of gears behind me, so I have 2 different size dies. It's plastic on the back. I don't know what the real material is, but this is foam, and there's a metal cutting surface inside, but it's not cutting my hands as I press on it. Let me bring the tray around and show you how to load this thing up. Okay, there's multiple layers that go underneath on the bed, like yay. And that adds the thickness, and different dyes have different thicknesses from other brands, so you do sometimes need to make adjustments. I'm going to show you how to cut the big gears. So I've got those in place there. And then I also have already prepared 2 pieces of fabric, both with fusible web on the back. Now, what I want to point out is I can cut as many as 8 layers of fabric with fusible in my cutter here, but I'm also building these in sections where I have my light and my shadow together so that they just stay nice and organized. And that way at the end of it, I have equal amounts of bright gears and shadow gears. Once that's there, then I'm going to put my protective layer on the top here and come on over to the cutting machine. Now I start to push this through here, and the pressure of all of that starts the knob to spin or the handle to spin, and then I just grab it and continue working through here. You might even hear that plastic on top being re-scarred. Every time you run it through there, it's going to get scarred, and it's no big deal. And let me just take this part out to make life easy here. Okay? Now, voila, just like that. We have our wonderful gears. I can quickly expose one of them and probably even expose the other so I can show you how to do the shadows. Let's tidy up a little bit. So that's the first one. Sometimes the top surface doesn't cut all the way through or hits a little snag, so you can just cut that little part out with scissors if you need. But once our gears are made, so easy. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my light gear, and technically before I start building any of these, I'm going to peel the paper side off of at least the top layer, if not both layers. We'll just do the top for now, easy management. And then what I can do is I'm going to match up my gears. And the reason I peeled the paper off the first is so I don't have to peel it off later once I get these all organized, but it's getting a little stickier. And then what I did is I just kind of offset the gear itself so that the shadow showed up and the light side showed up. And you're probably noticing that the die is just slightly larger than the 10 squares. And some of these little chunks and stuff, I actually have all of those in the quilt too, because they add a little bit of character, in my opinion, a little bit of nibbling in the gears, old age gears, right? So let's talk about how to manage the shadows, and you'll be ready to get started. So this is the light source up here in my quilt. So therefore, I want my shadows to be in the appropriate position or opposite my light source. So if you look carefully, here's where the light was coming from. And I have all of my shadows on the lower end or back side of the gears themselves. So it just feels natural and gives you that very three-dimensional effect. So let's take it step by step. I'm going to give you the wrap up. Are you ready if you're taking notes, right? So build your background, construct your broken dishes quilt all the way through. And then what I really do is I take a giant piece of batting, not fusible. I lay it on my design table, not wall. That way I can take my gears and I can position them around on the quilt. And then when it's all done, I literally bring my iron to the quilt instead of bringing the quilt to the iron. Nothing moves, and that gives me the opportunity to go through and press down. You're going to have to heat set these onto the quilt to anchor them down. And then the final step is free motion machine quilting. So the free motion quilting here, you can see I used black thread for all of my gear so that I wasn't constantly changing thread, and that just sped up the efficiency, right? Then for the rest of the background, I kind of tried a Da Vinci style blueprint quilting, and it was going fairly successfully. Don't look real close. And then you could just offer like little swirling movements or little line shapes. There's a few sections up in here where I kind of just was following the patterns of the triangles themselves, just kind of mixing it up to add different textures, right? So anyways, those of you who have never heard about steampunk, I hope I've offered you a little extra coolness in your life, because I think it's awesome stuff. I really hope you enjoyed this gear quilt. I know some of you have been following along on our Facebook page and saw us leaking photos, and we're very excited to see it. I hope it was all you were looking for here today at Man Sewing.